Caroline Norma is a feminist abolitionist, academic, and author from Australia. And she's going to give us a 15-minute presentation about these issues. And so over to you, Caroline.
Those of us living in Western liberal countries will be familiar with the accusation that criticising transgenderism is an act of hostility towards the left, as we've heard. According to our detractors, this criticism can only be right-wing and reactionary and always give strength to anti-progressive forces. The accusation has facilitated, I think, a purge of radical feminists from the left over the past decade that has been cheered on by progressives of all stripes, including the Labor parties of countries like Australia and the UK. This kind of leftist purge has historical precedent, as some here will know, in the attack upon Leon Trotsky, his family, his supporters all over the world by Stalinists in the 1930s. Even Trotsky's supporters in China were murdered, and the world's left supported this attack on a leader of the Bolshevik Revolution who was marginalised after Lenin's death. Efforts were made in 1937 by John Dewey and others to correct some of the misinformation, but by this stage it was too late. So even today, you'll see leftists not generally refer to Trotsky or his writings. I think this history of what was done to Trotsky by the left is worth knowing about for us today, even if there are major differences between Stalinism and transgenderism. One difference is the shorter time over which the Bolsheviks came under attack from Stalinists before the purge began. In contrast to that, radical feminists have been under attack from the left since the sexual revolution more than 40 years ago, whereas obviously the Stalinism occurred within 10 years of the Bolshevik Revolution, so the time frame is different. Obviously, the contemporary transgenderist purge of radical feminists from the left hasn't come with the murder and the torture that Trotsky faced. But then we're not living in a time of worldwide war, and we must remember that political circumstances can change quickly. A more important difference, I think, is the fact that radical feminists are mostly women, and so are members of a population already set up for attack by institutions like pornography. Trotsky, of course, was Jewish, so he had some of the same vulnerability, and the Stalinist campaign against him had the backing of an entire nation state. But whether or not the campaign against radical feminists too ends up achieving the backing of an entire nation state with the next American administration is something to be seen. And I know that last week, Kelly J. Keane here called on our American sisters to redouble their resistance to that looming threat. But I do mention this historical parallel, not actually to talk about the situation facing gender critical feminists in the West, as much as sisters outside of it. And by outside of the West, I mean those societies with weak bases of liberalism, such as Japan and Pakistan. So while women's situation in Japan, of course, can't be compared to that of sisters in Pakistan, I think the two countries are useful to us to show societies that have really weak bases of liberalism. And so feminists there are even more vulnerable than feminists in countries like Australia. First up is the Japanese Anti-Pornography and Prostitution Research Group in Tokyo, and this is an abolitionist group that was founded in 1999. And they posted, I'm sorry for all this text on the screen, but they posted this letter in support of J.K. Rowling's, J.K. Rowling writes about her reasons back in June last year. And they published a letter of support in Japanese and English on their website. Even though transgenderism does not yet have the grip on Japan that it does the West, feminists here in June managed to perceive of the fact that, as they said, in red here on the left-hand side of the screen, that what we face is an anti-fascist struggle of the 21st century. And given that Japanese people experienced fascism only 75 years ago and legacies of that history are still very much in society today, we might see this statement as unfortunately well informed about the nature of the campaign currently facing radical feminists. Then Natasha Noreen on the right-hand side of the slide here spoke via one of these feminist webinars just a month ago in December and emphasised the absolutism of the reaction that gender-critical feminists face in Pakistan. In Pakistan, liberals are apparently quick to abandon their own principles of inclusivity and open debate when it comes to transgenderism. They summarily purge critics from progressive circles, no matter what kind of advocacy these critics are involved in. So in Natasha's words, in Pakistan, here in red on the right-hand side of the screen, the tag of transphobia comes in and you're gone. In countries like this, liberals don't seem to feel compelled to make excuses for their purging of feminists from the left, like some of the Western liberals do. Western liberals come up with excuses for their illiberal behaviour, and so that's why we hear these stories about radical feminists being aligned with the right, or gender critical feminism as inflicting violence upon trans people. But developments in countries like Pakistan and Japan, I think, where liberalism has provided little protection to radicals from the outset of the purge, will likely and unfortunately model future developments elsewhere in our own countries. And but I think, therefore, hearing about the insights of sisters like Natasha Noreen is crucial to our gender critical resistance, I think. But of course, ourselves, we have already seen anti-liberal absolutism strengthen in Western societies too. So but I think in Western societies, does remain some small pockets of protection, liberal protection, for our political activity. I was thinking mainly through the judiciary and some small initiatives of government policy making as still standing as a slight buffer for radical activity in the West. What has changed, though, I think, over the past 10 years is the likelihood that liberal feminists will stay quiet on the sidelines in the waging when we wage our political activity. Of course, liberal feminists in the past, as Sheila Jeffreys and others here know too well, they did oppose and obstruct our efforts against prostitution and pornography. But with transgenderism, it feels to me that they seem to take their behavioural lead now from the extremist libertarians and the sex radicals. And so it means they put themselves at the front of the attack on radical feminists, in my experience. On the right-hand side of the screen here are my colleagues at RMIT University, who for many years now kept their complaints about my abolitionist activity against prostitution and pornography, kept their complaints within the university or within the Australian university sector. However, last year, they ran to the tabloid gay press, which is this article here, when they thought they saw an opportunity to novel me on the gender identity issue, which was a change, I think. And I think the reason we see liberals like this now turning themselves into the shock troops of the leftist purge is because they themselves are increasingly politically wedged. Crucial to liberalism, as people here will already know, are ideas of the self-regarding individual with an inner residing personality or essence that must be given expression to if the person is to be politically empowered. Since the sexual revolution, this inner essence has increasingly been one of sexuality, but over the past 10 years, the essence has evolved even further and morphed into an essence of gender identity. Before this development, liberals in Western countries tended to be able to rely on the idea of the autonomous individual for their political power. But now, with this advent of the super individual with not only a unique personality and a unique sexuality, but also now a unique gender identity as well, liberals like my colleagues, I think, find themselves scrambling to prove their commitment to the individual and to reject any trace and smell of affiliation with any group-based not identity, any group affiliation. On the other side of the wedge are currently sort of socialist feminists or pseudo-socialist feminists like Nancy Fraser, who write books like, what was it, Feminism for the 99%, an absolute piece of trash, but nonetheless, books like that criticise liberal feminists directly and call for women to devote themselves to any form of political activity except for feminism, and even liberal feminism and liberal feminists are named criticised directly in that book. But the liberal feminists used to campaign as femocrats in government and at the United Nations, but space for that kind of political activity now is dwindling, I think. And so liberal feminists now have to reinvent themselves, and true to historical form, they do so through scapegoating radical feminists. Further, as Natasha Noreen mentioned in her speech in December, liberal feminists in the Western Academy attempt to consolidate their position now by exporting transgender ideology to places like Pakistan. They do so with no regard for the effect of such ideas on societies, holding deep conservative views of biological hierarchy, and they're doing so in Japan too, to horrible results. And this is surely the great heartbreaking influence of radical feminism that Natasha mentioned. I thought that was a fantastic quote from her, the great heartbreaking influence of liberal feminism. Ironically, the success of liberal feminists in reinventing themselves, and some of us might remember this from 10 years ago, I think it was a phenomenon of the Academy more than anything, the liberal feminists really depended on these anthropological stories of the Pakistani Hijra. If anyone remembers the HIJRA Pakistani Hijra, who I think was sold to the Western audiences to persuade them that of the idea of the existence of a third sex. I think the irony of this history particularly is that today countries like Pakistan and Japan now face the erasure of the female sex, very far from 10 years ago when we were apparently endorsing the recognition of a whole 3 sexes. So to conclude, women in places like Pakistan and Japan had little opportunity in the first place to be part of society, let alone to cultivate the kind of liberalism that created space in Western societies for the development of feminism. Their liberation struggle is being thwarted by transgenderism even before it's gotten started. So our struggle to retain sex-based protections is therefore a global one, of course, and I particularly think these feminist webinars are at the forefront of and going a long way to making our movement an internationalist one as it needs to be. So I really wanted to thank everyone here and the organisers especially. So thanks so much. And I know this conversation's been about the left and the right, and so it should be, and it's a really important conversation to be having. But I wonder whether we also need to start cleaning up our own backyard and looking at the pre-existing abolitionist organisations through the world, well, abolitionists and other radical feminist organisations that have yet not put statements on their front web pages in support of gender critical feminism. And I know that there are some fantastic organisations, Wolf, and in Japan, and I'll give the example of Japan actually, I'm sorry to harp on it, but the pre-existing, it was set up in 1999 as the Japan's major abolitionist organisation, the Anti-Pornography and Prostitution Research Group, and they went on the front foot on this issue and have, as a result, both attracted a lot of attacks, but also attracted a lot of support from feminists, and now they've become sort of a central pillar of the gender critical feminist movement in Japan. And they were a pre-existing abolitionist organisation, so they haven't taken the kind of tact that I see other abolitionist organisations taking through the world, where they sort of say, well, but if we take on the transgender issue, then we're going to lose ground on the other, prostitution and pornography. That's a misguided view, and it's playing out now. We can see it more than ever. It might have, I can understand that kind of view arising 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Obviously, we're a really weak movement, and we were weak in abolition as well. I can understand why people would take that kind of view, but I think now that those kind of arguments have, got to stop, and we've really got to see statements on the front pages of front pages of abolitionist organisations throughout the world supporting this movement, is my view.